Okay, today in religion, we are going back to our chapter 2. On Tuesday, when we did religion last from the book, we talked about stages 1 and 2. Who remembers what stages 1 and 2 were about? Who can share with us what we learned about? Brielle? Primeval. What is primeval history? Because you're right, that stage 1 is primeval. What does that mean? That's kind of a goofy sounding word. What kind of history was that? Remember, all these stages are the stages in the Bible. So what does the primeval mean? Peyton?
It happened like before recorded history?
Yeah, it happened before things were written down. So when we're thinking back to Adam and Eve, things weren't written down about Adam and Eve. That is the primeval history. We also talked about stage 2, the patriarchs. What were the patriarchs about? Oh, goodness. Tuesday was a long time ago. The patriarchs were in the book of Genesis. The first 11 books of Genesis are the primeval. Then chapters 12 to 50 would be the patriarchs. This is the stage that God began the process of repairing our damaged relationship with Him, making the covenant with the people. Nolan?
It's not here.
Okay.
I checked my backpack. It's not
Okay.
here.
So you're just going to have to follow along, maybe get a piece of loose leaf to write down answers. I have it up on the board. So I have loose leaf in the back, and it might be in your locker. If you still can't find it, come Monday, I'll give you a new packet. Okay. All right, so let's go to our book, page 28. We're going to start with chapter 3. So we're going to start with stage 3. So stage 3, the Egypt and the Exodus, and stage 4, the Promised Land and the Judges. So we're going to read both those stages today. Look at it's a fill in the blank for our questions. So you're going to have to be kind of looking at our questions as we're doing the reading and filling in the blanks as we go. Number 1 says the book of blank teaches that the descendants of Jacob's children were enslaved in Egypt. So as we're reading, when you hear us read that sentence, find that word that is missing to fill in. So the third stage of salvation history is the account of the Exodus from slavery in Egypt. At the beginning of the book of Exodus, we discover that the descendants of Jacob's children, called the Israelites, were enslaved in Egypt. God heard their cries and called Moses to lead them out of slavery. So, just a hint, look at number 2, who led them out of slavery. I just read the sentence. But Pharaoh, the Egyptian leader, had a hard heart. God had to send terrible plagues to make Pharaoh let the Israelites go. The Israelites' escape from Egypt and journey to the Holy Land is called the Exodus. How many of us have heard that story of Moses and the Exodus? Seriously, only a handful of us know that story? How many plagues did God send because they wouldn't let the people leave? Okay, so we know the story of the plagues. Moses is the key person in the plagues. So how many plagues did he send, Kira?
He said 7. Also, I've seen the movie. I think he said 7. Everybody said that. I actually watched the movie like a few times.
Yeah.
So I know a lot about it, I guess.
So there were lots of plagues that he sent, like the turning the water to blood, the sending the locusts, so the whole land was covered with the locusts. Lots of different plagues. The last plague is the one that most of us know. What was the last plague, Peyton?
Where he went around and every house that didn't have something written on their door, he would send like an angel to like kill the firstborn child.
The firstborn boy.
Boy. Of the
Yep. So the angel of death was coming. So God told Moses to tell the Israelites to be prepared and to put the lamb's blood on their doorframe, and the angel of death would know to pass over their house. If they didn't have the lamb's blood on the doorframe, then he would kill the firstborn boy in each house. So then, if the angel of death passed over, they were all saved. What do we call this holiday as we remember it? When the angel of death passed over their houses. Scarlett? Passover. And Passover is still celebrated in the Jewish faith, and they celebrate it right around the time that we celebrate Easter. So as Christians, we celebrate Passover because it's still our history. The Jewish faith doesn't celebrate Easter because they don't celebrate Jesus, but they will celebrate Passover. And so it's usually around the same time. And my parents have had a Passover dinner when I was little at our house. And it's a certain type of food that you have to prepare because it's the type of food that the Israelites prepared. They had to prepare with unleavened bread, so that way they didn't have to wait for that yeast to make the bread rise, and they'd be ready to go at a moment's notice. So as soon as the angel of death passed over all the houses, the Israelites all left. So it's certain foods, and they all have specific symbolic meaning to them. So it's really neat when you get closer to the Easter season. We'll be talking about this story and the Passover, so we know what it all means. Kira.
There's something I wanted to question about it. I know we're not there yet, but like, he just gave such cruel consequences to people who didn't believe in him. It just feels wrong.
Yeah, and that's a good thing to think about. Not all of his consequences were like horrifying consequences, but sometimes they were really drastic. Like think about the story of Noah and the flood, and he floods the world and people drowned. Think about this story where he's killing all the firstborn with the angel of death. It seems pretty drastic. You're right. It is kind of horrifying. But we also have to look at it with the spiritual lens. Remember, this is a spiritual history, religious history, not historical history. So we also have to keep that in mind as we look at these different stories. And I know at my old school, the priests would come around sometimes and stop in the rooms, or I might invite Father Zarin or Father Zip to stop in. This would be a great question to ask them, why some of these consequences were so drastic. So I think that would be a good question to ask, and maybe they would have a good theological explanation for it. So actually what I did last year was I would always have somebody write down in their planner. They had a list of questions to ask if somebody came. Kira, can I make you be our scribe? Can you write down that question in your planner so we have a list? All right, the second paragraph. On the way to the promised land, so they are going through the desert trying to get to the promised land. The Israelites stopped at Mount Sinai. There, God renewed the covenant he had made with Abraham, and he extended it to all the Israelites. He gave Moses the 10 Commandments, which the people must obey as part of the covenant. During the Exodus, the people frequently complained and lost their faith in God. Where were the people? They're walking. What are they walking through? The desert. Do you think that's easy to walk through a desert?
No.
Who knows how long they were walking through the desert? Tristan?
40 years.
40 years.
Oh God.
So think about you walking through a desert for 40 years. I would have a hard time walking through a desert for one day. They're walking for 40 years. So they did a lot of complaining. They lost their faith. They needed to remember that God will always take care of you. Remember Abraham, we talked about, God told him to kill his son Isaac, and he said, God told me my descendants would number amongst the stars, and if he's saying I need to do this, I need to have faith that it will all work out in the end. The Israelites wandering through the desert lost their faith. They're like, well, what's going on? We're hungry, we're thirsty, we're tired. And they lost their faith that it would all work out. As a consequence of that, they were forced to wander in the desert for 40 years. So the more they complained, the longer they had to wander. And only their children were able to enter the promised land. When Moses went up on Mount Sinai to get the 10 Commandments, who knows what the people were doing on the ground, Kira?
Oh, worshiping something random.
They were worshiping the golden idols. Instead of worshiping God and praying to God, they were praying to the golden calf. And they lost that faith. They should have been praying to God. They were praying to false idols. So that's part of that losing their faith. Kira?
I mean, it's probably because they made him walk in the desert for 40 years and they were not very happy.
But they hadn't been walking for 40 years yet.
Oh, well.
So, but still walking for a week, they were complaining. God sent them the manna from heaven, that bread from heaven. He sent quail. Moses was able to use his staff to turn rock to water. They were being taken care of. They needed to have faith that it would be okay in the end. Sometimes you have to suffer a little to get to the wonderful things. Stage 4, the promised land and the judges. In the 4th stage of salvation history, the Israelites reach and settle the promised land. These accounts appear in the books of Joshua and Judges in the Old Testament. Moses died before the Israelites could enter the promised land called Canaan. So God chose a new leader, Joshua, to lead the people into Canaan. Much of Canaan was inhabited by other people, so the Israelites needed to fight to gain control of the land. Whenever they trusted God, they were successful in their battles. Whenever they lost faith in God, they failed. So you have to have faith. God will make it okay. Eventually, they gained control of the promised land, and each of the 12 tribes received its own section of the land. Then new invaders, the Philistines, tried to capture the land. During this stage of salvation history, the Israelites had no king. God was their ruler, but God called special prophets and warriors called judges to help deliver justice and defend the land against the Philistine invasions. So, just a recap of what we learned. God heard the cry of his children in Egypt and called Moses to lead them out of the slavery into the desert. So he knew that they were enslaved in Egypt and he saved them. While wandering in the desert, God gave Moses and the people the commandments of the covenant that taught these once enslaved people how to live out their newfound freedom with responsibility and love. Follow the 10 Commandments. The Israelites reached the promised land, were led into it by Joshua, and fought to gain control of the land. Once the Israelites were settled in the promised land, God called special prophets and warriors, called judges, to help deliver justice and defend the land against the invaders. Peyton.
Who are the Philistines?
They were from a different country, Philistine. So they're the people that were not Christians. They did not have faith in God. Well, actually, they weren't called Christians back then because Jesus wasn't here yet. This is the Old Testament. So they did not believe in God. So the Israelites believed in God and had faith in God. The Philistines were just people from another country that didn't have the same beliefs.
Does that country still exist?
It goes by a new name, and I would have to look. I don't know the history of the Middle East well enough to be able to tell you. I mean, all these countries that we're talking about still exist, but they might be with a different name to it. Nick?
Isn't it the Philippines?
No. So the Philippines are islands in the ocean. Philistine was a country, like they lived in where the Middle East area is, where like Iran, Iraq, Syria, all over in that area. So that's like where Israel is. So it's all over in that area. Penelope.
If someone did believe in a different God and have the same religion as us, what would happen to that?
What would happen to them? What do you mean?
I don't know.
I'm not quite understanding your question, so try asking it in a different way for me. So you had said if people had a different religion.
When people do have a different religion and don't believe in like the same God as us, like I don't know.
So are you thinking like heaven? Is heaven the same for the
Yeah.
different religions? Like what happens when they die? There are different thoughts on what happens. Some people believe that you have to be Catholic to get up into heaven. Some people believe that you have to believe in Jesus and be a Christian. Some people believe that as long as you live a good life, that you get up into heaven. Some people don't believe that there's a heaven. So some people think that when you die, your body gets put in the ground and your existence stops. So there's lots of different thoughts out there on what would happen. That's another great question to ask if we have Father Zarin or Father Zip come in to explain what would happen for somebody of a different faith or a different religion, because they believe in their own different afterlives, like where they would go. Are there like all these different heavens up there and promised lands and that would be a great explanation for us to get from one of the priests. Okay, so that's a good question to have. Not quite with what we're learning about right now, so that's something that we can come back to. So you should have your stages 3 and 4 filled out for this chapter 2. So look at that reading guide, stages 3 and 4.